As Katie mentioned, my name is Roger Berland. I'm from the New York area, Westchester County, north of, there's a bit of an echo there. I'll leave it further. They'll figure it out. So I'm a senior solutions engineer with HashiCorp. Is this on? Do I need to lower it? Okay. Senior solutions engineer with HashiCorp. I work with all of the HashiCorp products, but I specialize in Terraform and Sentinel. So my contact information is there as well. A little bit about my background in connection with this talk. I have actually written a lot of the Sentinel policies that are in one of HashiCorp's GitHub repositories called Terraform Guides, and I've been doing that for a while and continually improving them. I also wrote a guide called Writing and Testing Sentinel Policies for Terraform, or something like that. So in any case, that's something I'll mention later. The primary objective of this session is to show how Terraform Sentinel policies can easily be tested with Sentinel Simulator using mocks generated from Terraform plans. Now, I should say a little bit about what mocks are. I'm going to say more about them later, but for now, what you need to know is that a mock simulates the data that Terraform normally presents to Sentinel after you run a plan. And so the purpose of the mocks is to use them with this thing called the Sentinel Simulator. So some of you, probably a lot of you, might have attended a talk yesterday given by our lead Sentinel engineer, Chris Marchese. So you would have heard him talk about Sentinel and the simulator. So before I go on and give some more details, of course, I've talked about the objective. A natural question is why? Why would you want to use the simulator to test your policies? So these mocks that can be generated from the Terraform Cloud UI and the API, before they existed, the way I would write Sentinel policies is I just realized I can use my clicker. I forgot after all that. What I would do is the only way to really test a new Sentinel policy or one that you were writing was to actually run a plan against a Terraform Enterprise workspace. So I would run a plan. I see people shaking their heads. So I'd run a plan. I'd wait for the plan to finish. And then I could see what the policy did, right? The policy check would be run automatically. And hopefully it would work. But even as many Sentinel policies as I've written, I still make mistakes. And then I would get some error, and I'd have to go fix it. And then I would start all over again, right? And I have to wait for that plan to run every time. And the plan generally takes longer, quite a bit longer than the Sentinel policy checks. The policy checks are actually very quick, like just a few seconds. So the main reason for using the simulator with these mocks is that you can speed up the creation of new Sentinel policies since you don't have to wait for the plans to run. When you're using the simulator, you can use it on a machine that doesn't even have Terraform. It's like it's separate and detached from Terraform. A second reason to use the simulator with mocks is that it enables you to test various combinations of possible attributes with a single command. So I think of it as kind of testing them simultaneously. It's probably one after another, but they're so quick that you do one command and you're testing 2, 4, 10 test cases. So that, of course, also speeds up your process for writing new policies and for testing existing ones if you make changes to them. Okay, so I do want to do some level setting. As I mentioned, Chris Marchese talked yesterday about what Sentinel is, but not all of you were necessarily there. So I'll talk a little bit about what Sentinel is, and then I'll talk about how Sentinel is used in Terraform, and that will include discussing some Sentinel imports, or these are Terraform-specific Sentinel imports, and also Sentinel mocks. And then I'll lay out my methodology for writing and testing Terraform Sentinel policies using the simulator. Okay, and then finally I'll do a demo of all this. So what is Sentinel and how is it used in Terraform? HashiCorp Sentinel is a framework for implementing governance as code in the same way that Terraform implements infrastructure as code, right? So you're codifying what your policies are in a way where those policies are actually going to be run in the line of execution. So Sentinel includes its own language and is embedded in HashiCorp's enterprise products. Using Sentinel ensures that your governance policies are actually being checked, right? Instead of just sitting in a spreadsheet somewhere, right? It's nice to have policies in a spreadsheet or a Word document, but that doesn't really help if they're not being enforced. And Sentinel does support fine-grained policies that use conditional logic, and that means you can implement pretty sophisticated policies. And most of these policies, by the way, are going to be focused on restricting what you can provision, right? Sometimes it can also be focused on looking at what you've already provisioned, but it's mostly proactively making sure that you don't provision VMs or networks, subnets, load balancers, security groups, whatever it might be, various types of resources across any cloud, making sure that the resources you are going to provision with Terraform in the apply step are actually meeting your policies. And obviously, as I've mentioned already, it does include a simulator. Okay, so Sentinel policies, are checked between the standard plan and the apply steps within a Terraform run in Terraform Cloud and Terraform Enterprise. And I should mention here, Sentinel, generally speaking, is used with HashiCorp's enterprise products. So in this presentation, when I say Terraform, I really mean Terraform Cloud, the SaaS solution of Terraform, or I mean Terraform Enterprise, which we used to refer to as private Terraform Enterprise, right? The PTFE on-premise, or your own dedicated server, either on-premise or in a cloud, any of the major clouds. So first of all, like I said, the Sentinel policies are run between the plan and the apply, and violations prevent runs from progressing to the apply stage, the apply step, unless a user with sufficient authority overrides those failed policies. Okay, so there are certain people who can do that, the owners of an organization, and people with a particular permission called managed policies. Sentinel policies can evaluate the attributes of existing and new resources and also data sources based on information associated with the current run. And that information includes the plan itself, the configuration, which means the code, the current state of the workspace, and other run data. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Ultimately, this ensures that resources comply with all of your policies before you provision them. So this is a diagram showing how this works in practice. I probably can't use the laser from here, so I won't try. But what you're seeing here, going from left to right, is typically you're going to have some kind of Terraform code loaded out of a VCS repository into a Terraform Cloud workspace, and that will trigger a plan, right? Just like open source Terraform, you could do Terraform plan. So you trigger the plan, and if the plan is successful, meaning that it didn't give any kind of errors, then Terraform Enterprise, Terraform Cloud will automatically trigger the Sentinel policy checks. If all of those policy checks pass, now the users or the people who are logged in or are authorized to do so will have the ability to, click a button or, use a CLI command or the API to actually, do the apply. And that apply is what's going to provision the infrastructure. If any of the Sentinel policy checks fail, you do have, like I said, there are people who can override that in some cases. So this is just showing, this is a screenshot of a run within a Terraform Cloud workspace, and it's showing, how we have the plan and the policy check, and then the apply. We can even see, who did it. R. Berlin, that's me, 13 days ago, did the apply. Okay, so with that, I want to move on and talk about Sentinel Imports and Sentinel Mocks. So Sentinel does include several standard imports. Imports are essentially, think of them as modules that extend the capabilities of Sentinel. And some of the standard ones are things for manipulating strings, JSON documents, decimal numbers, some other things as well, time, SOC addresses, etc. Terraform adds several additional imports that are unique for Terraform. So these are Sentinel imports to be used with Terraform, and there's 4 of these currently. The TF plan import gives access to the Terraform plan used by the current run. The TF config import gives you access to the configuration, meaning the code. So you can actually look at, hey, what was the, in other words, the difference here is the plan is going to show you what the value of something was, whereas the configuration is going to show you what did the code snippet look like. Maybe you had $brace something, right? And so it's showing you more, hey, what did the code look like? And that can be useful sometimes. The TF state import gives you access to the current state of that workspace, And the TF run gives you access to some workspace metadata and also the new cost estimate data that was announced yesterday morning. So that's in there as well. The most common of these is the TF plan import, because this is the one that people can use, like I said, to stop the provisioning of resources that would violate your policies, because you're able to restrict specific attributes of specific resources. And by the way, this works with any provider. It doesn't have to be an official HashiCorp provider or a provider on our website. Sentinel can restrict any attribute of any resource of any provider, even if you wrote the provider yourself. So that's all made available to Sentinel. Okay, so now let's talk about the mocks. Mocks, you know, like Mockingbird, right? They mock something else. The mocks simulate the data that, if you were running in Terraform Enterprise, it's the data that the plan would make available to those Sentinel policy checks. So you have this data, but it's human readable. You can take those mocks, and now you can start to copy them and edit them and start to use them with the simulator. So there is one mock for each of the 4 Terraform Sentinel imports. They can be generated from recent plans using the Terraform Cloud UI or the API. And then, like I said, you can copy and edit them to simulate various combinations of resource attributes. And of course, then you use these with the simulator. And using mocks with the simulator has the benefits that I mentioned in my why slide, right? It speeds up your testing, and it also makes sure that you're testing multiple scenarios, you know, very easily. And that includes both while you're developing the policy and later on if you do change the policy. Okay, so with that, I'm going to move on and talk about my 8-step methodology for writing and testing Sentinel policies with Terraform. And this is based on this guide, which I'll show you later. I have links at the end that I'll share with you. So this basic methodology is 8 steps. The first step is to create a Terraform configuration that creates certain resources. You're going to create resources that you want to restrict with a Sentinel policy. Could be AWS instance, Azure VM, vSphere, virtual machine. Could be anything at all, any resource. Second step is to create a Terraform Cloud workspace that uses the configuration. In other words, that's going to map to a VCS repository that contains that configuration, most likely. You then run a plan against the workspace, generate the mocks from the plan inside the UI, write a new Sentinel policy. So, of course, if you're going to test policies with the simulator, you better have a policy, right? So write a Sentinel policy that restricts those resources that you were creating in step 1. Now you can start to create some test cases and test your policy with the simulator. And you can then basically revise your policy and test cases until all of the test cases pass, right? Once they're all, the simulator actually will see during the demo, it prints stuff green or red. Green is good, red is bad. And, you want everything to be green. Once you've gotten to that point, you can now take your policy and deploy it to a Terraform Cloud organization, right? So that's essentially the methodology. I'm going to focus here on the ones that are in boldface. I'm not going to really focus too much on the writing of the Sentinel policies. I want to focus more on, and I'm going to demo, running a plan, generating the mocks, creating the test cases and editing them and stuff like that, and then, actually running the simulator. But what I'm going to do here, I could just launch into the demo at this point, but I think it's better for you if I actually walk through this in slides. So I'll walk through the process so you get a feeling for it, and also this is good later on if you download this presentation, once it's available, you'll have that in the slides as well. So run a plan and generate mocks. You can basically run a plan against a Terraform Cloud workspace or select one that you ran within the past 7 days. We keep the data, the mock data for that plan will be kept for 7 days. You then expand the plan in the TFC UI, Terraform Cloud UI, click the Download Sentinel Mocks button, and at that point, after a minute, this is going to download a tar GZ file with 4 mocks, right? 1 mock for each of the imports. Then you can extract the mock files from the tar file, and now you can start to copy them and edit them. So that's this first part. One thing I do want to point out, Chris had reminded me to add this in actually, is that mocks can contain sensitive data. For instance, cloud credentials that could be in there, right? Or vault tokens, right? I mean, there could be sensitive data in there, so do treat the mocks carefully. Handle them in a secure fashion. This is a screenshot of the Terraform UI of a run in the UI with a plan that's been run, and there we see, the button that you can click. it's good that, since I don't have my laser pointer anyways, or I wouldn't be able to reach up there, I did a simulated laser pointer. In any case, that's the button that you click inside a plan. And that was essentially step 4 of the process there. Step 5 was writing the Sentinel policies. Again, I'll show you briefly part of a policy during the demo, but I did want to mention that in this demo, I'm using 2 Sentinel policies. One is restricting Google Compute instances to only have certain allowed machine types, so N1 standard 1, N1 standard 2, and N1 standard 4. And then the second policy is an S3 policy that's restricting, or a Sentinel policy that's restricting AWS S3 buckets, right? And the idea there is to make sure that every bucket that you provision with Terraform is going to have the private ACL and be encrypted with a KMS key, right? So in other words, this is coming from the security team. So you start to get the feeling, by the way, that there's almost like, there's probably more than 2, but essentially, I think there's, broadly speaking, there's 2 kinds of policies. Some policies are focused on cost, right, containment, right, trying to reduce costs and avoid people accidentally doing things that cost a lot of money. And the other one is often more security focused, right, making sure that things are encrypted. There's probably a lot of other things as well, but those are 2 of the primary use cases for Sentinel in Terraform. Anyways, the second policy, the reason I included this is it's useful for illustrating how you test a policy that has multiple conditions. Okay, so with that, walking through the process again, you've generated your mocks, you've downloaded them, you now need to create test case directories that use the mocks. So under the directory containing your policy, you create a test directory, and under that test directory, you want to create a directory with the same name as your policy, except without the .sentinel extension. The Sentinel simulator is quite particular about the naming of these directories, so you have to get this right. Otherwise, your test cases won't be found. So like in the case of our restrict GCE machine type Sentinel policy, you create a restrict GCE machine type directory under the test directory. And then you can copy the TF plan mock file that you had downloaded and extracted from the workspace to that directory, to the second directory. And then you can move on and create a test case that's going to be a pass test case. So what I advise people to do is take that mock file, rename it to be mock TF plan pass.sentinel, and then you create a test case called pass.json that looks like this. And this test case has 2 things in it. One is it's saying that we're going to be using a mock of type TF plan, and this is the specific file we're going to be using. And by the way, I should mention that the mocks have the Sentinel extension because the mocks actually contain Sentinel code. That's why they have the Sentinel extension. And then we have a second condition in the test case which says the main rule, remember Sentinel policies have rules, and they always have a main rule. So we're saying the main rule has to return true for this test case to pass. Then we do the same thing with a fail test case. We make a copy of the mock file called mock TF plan fail.sentinel, and we have a similar fail.json test case. The main difference here is that it's pointing at the copied mock file, and then we're saying that the main rule should give false. Okay? This can be a little bit confusing because ultimately with the Sentinel simulator, you want all your test cases to pass. You'd like everything to be green. I mentioned that earlier, which means that when you have a test case that's a failure test case, you want the main rule to return false so that failure of the main rule makes the test case pass. So it's a little bit odd. Okay, then you can edit your mocks. You basically want to edit your mocks. I'm going to go a little faster here. You edit your mock TF plan pass Sentinel file so that it has legitimate values, machine types that are allowed. You edit the mock TF plan fail Sentinel mock file so that the main rule will give false, which means we're going to use something like N1 standard 8, right? That's not one of the allowed things. And then you can test with the simulator. You go up 2 directories, and these are the commands you can run. Things like sentinel test -run equals GCE, or you can do the same thing and add on the verbose option. What the run argument is doing is it's doing partial name matching on any part of the name of the policy. So in other words, if you had multiple policies in a directory and you only want to run one of them, you can now basically indicate with a partial name match which ones you want to run. To test all of your policies, you would just leave off the run argument, and that would test everything. Okay, so with that, we're ready to move on to the demo. Everything that I'm using in this demo is actually in this repository, which I'm going to show you now. So this HashiCorp 2019 repository over in GitHub. It's in my R. Berlin organization. And we can see that there's several directories here. We have the AWS S3, bucket directory that has a main.tf file, right? Terraform code that provisions an S3 bucket. And I use that to basically so that I could run a plan and generate mocks for that. And I have the corresponding GCP compute instance directory with a main.tf file that provisions 2 Google Compute instances for the same reason, so that I could run a plan and generate mocks. And then I have my Sentinel directory with the 2 policies that I mentioned and my test cases. And then over here in the Terraform Cloud UI, I have an organization. This is on the SaaS solution, right? This is in the public offering. I have Roger Berlin HashiCorp 2019 with 2 workspaces. And these workspaces have names that are exactly the same as those 2 directories, right? The first 2 directories with the Terraform code. If we go look at one of these, like the second one, the GCP compute instance, we can see in version control that, in fact, this is pointing at that repository, right? So in other words, we're saying this workspace takes its Terraform code from that repository, and specifically, it only reacts to changes within the GCP compute instance directory. Okay, so this is essentially pointing at that directory. Now with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to shrink the screen a bit so everything got resized when we connected to the monitor. So I'm going to queue a plan. I'll just call this mocks. And these plans usually run pretty quickly in Google. It should take about 30 seconds. So we see I'm running a plan. The plan is queued. Now it's running. You can see I'm using Terraform 0.12.6. And we see already that there's 2 compute instances to be added. And if I scroll back up momentarily, now I see my button, right? I see the download Sentinel mocks button, and I click that to generate the mocks and download them. And fortunately, that was quick today. And we see that it downloaded a tar file, which I can now show in Finder on my Mac. I can double click it to extract the contents, and we can look at that. And we see, like I mentioned, there are 4 mocks corresponding to the 4 imports. And we can take a look at one of them. Let's look at the TF plan mock. In fact, I'm only going to use the TF plan mocks today. I'm not using any of the other ones, although I have used them. And I've used all the imports and all the mocks in other policies. So here I've opened up this file. And we see it's provisioning a Google Compute instance with name demo1. And it has various attributes. We can see some of the scrolling here isn't that great, but you can see the machine type is N1 standard 1. Now I'm not actually going to use this file today because I already went through the process earlier before the demo, several days ago in fact, of downloading these mocks, copying them, editing them. Everything I talked about in PowerPoint I've already done. So what I want to do is I want to move on and take a look at the policy itself. Now this policy, that should be pretty readable. We import some different Sentinel imports, TF plan and strings. There's some functions here, and again, I don't want to go into the details of what the functions are doing, so I've intentionally kind of closed them within the editor. But I have one called find resources from plan, which is basically a function that will accept type as an argument, and it will return me all resources of a particular type across all modules within your Terraform configuration. All right, so that's what that one's doing. And then I have a second function, validate attributes in list, which is basically taking 3 arguments, the type of resource, the attribute, and a list. So what this is basically doing is saying, for the resource of the given type, this attribute has to have a value, or every single instance of that resource has to have the specific attribute in the particular list. We can see down here I have an allowed types list with N1 standard 1, 2, and 4, like I'd mentioned in the slides. And we can see I'm calling that second function with Google Compute instance, machine type, and allowed types, right? So that's what that policy is doing. So what I'm going to do is, this is the edited version of notice this one is the mock TF plan fail. This is the fail mock. And we can see it uses N1. Currently it uses N1 standard 1 and N1 standard 2. And in fact, I think I wanted this, it doesn't really matter. I wanted this pass to be over here, but it doesn't matter. But if we look, the fail one, they're actually identical now. They're identical because I kind of am starting out with one thing left undone. I'm kind of pretending here that I forgot to edit the mock, the fail mock, right? So I haven't set it up to fail yet. But what I'm going to do, having shown you those 3 files, what I'm going to do is go over to my terminal where we can see what directory I'm in. We can see that I'm in R Berlin HashiCorp 2019 Sentinel, right? This is the clone of that repository. And I've used tree to show you that inside that Sentinel directory, I have the policies and I have the various test cases. So let's start running some Sentinel simulator commands. Sentinel test, and I'm going to say -run equals GCE. All right, so the first one failed. This failed JSON, right? It's all in red. That failed, and it says it failed because we expected the main rule to be false, but we got true. The past test case was okay, right? That was green. So let's go back to the editor and let's actually fix this guy. So let's do a find, and I'm gonna replace, doesn't really matter which one I do, so I don't know why the quote came from. Let's do this. I'm gonna replace, find, there's 3, replace all instances of N1 standard 1 with N1 standard 8, and then I'm gonna save this file. So in other words, what I'm doing is now I am using a value that's not allowed, right, in my fail mock. So now when I go back and rerun that same command, both test cases are passing, right? They're passing, the fail one is passing because the main rule is returning false. Now what we can do is do that again, but now we'll add the verbose option. And now we see some additional details, right? We're getting, Sentinel has a print function, so inside a Sentinel policy, you can do print and print whatever you want. And so I happen to be in that policy, in the middle of one of those functions, I'm printing this message out. So when there's, when a resource has an attribute that's not in the allowed list, I'm printing out something saying, hey, it has this attribute and the machine type with a value N1 standard 8 that is not in the allowed list, right? In other words, what I'm trying to do here is give the person who violated the policy useful information that will let them know what resource they need to fix and why. You know, why do they have to fix it? Well, because they used a machine type that's not allowed. Okay, let's do this. Let's move on. We have 8 minutes left, which is plenty of time, actually. So I'm going to close these files, and I'm going to close this as well and just take a look at the test cases for AWS. So I'm going to open up the 4, let's open up the 4 Sentinel mock files here. And if we go through them in reverse order, what we can see, maybe I'll shrink this a little. Here we can see, for instance, this is an S3 bucket, and ACL here is set to private. Remember, this is the past test case, okay? This is the one that should conform to the policy. So private is good, and we have server-side encryption stuff set up with a KMS key, so that's all good, right? So that one's fine. This one is fail KMS. This one we can see that it's missing the server-side encryption. I'm going to shrink that a little more. Maybe I'll just move this over. There we go. So it doesn't have the server-side, right? There's no KMS key for this one, so that's a test case. This one says fail ACL is the test case, so the ACL is public read. That's not allowed. It does have the server-side encryption with the KMS key, right? So it's going to fail one of the conditions. And this one is going to fail both conditions. This one has ACL public read, and it has the server-side encryption as empty, right? So that's our 4th test case. So when we go back to the terminal session, and we go up here, go back a little, and I can do S3, we see all 4 of these test cases pass. And if I go here and add the verbose flag, now we get a whole bunch of messages, and what we get specifically is this first test case, fail ACL and KMS. It gives us the 2 error messages, right? It's saying that it's not private and it doesn't have a KMS key. The second one, fail ACL, right, is saying that, you know, this bucket, this log message here, has an ACL public read that is not private. You know, you get the idea, right? Fail KMS is saying there's a message saying that it's not encrypted with a KMS key, and then the pass one is okay. So that's the Sentinel simulator. That's the demo. The only thing left that I would like to do is come back to the slides, and I want to give you guys some useful links. These links in particular, I've lost my clicker here. There we go. The links here are specifically for the Sentinel documentation, also the Terraform Sentinel documentation, in other words, Sentinel docs specific to Terraform. Also documentation on generating the mocks and using the mocks. I have a link to this GitHub repository. The 4th one is that Terraform guides repository, and specifically the governance section of that has a lot of sample policies. Look specifically, by the way, when you go there, look at the 2nd generation policies that are kind of newer. They're obviously newer than the 1st generation policies. You'll find those more modern and more comprehensive, more production ready. They're doing things like iterating across all resources, printing better error messages, doing things like giving you the full address of any resource that violates a policy. So think addresses like module.a.module.b.aws_instance, some name, .0, whatever. And then there's this link to this guide that I mentioned for writing and testing Sentinel policies for Terraform. That's just up here. I have I have that here as well. But this is this whole, you can read it in HTML if you want, or you can just download the PDF version. So that has a lot of useful information. And this is actually the second edition of this. I wrote one edition and then I figured out how to make it even better. So, sorry, let's go back here. That's basically it. I just wanted to wrap up by thanking all of you for attending. I hope you found it useful and interesting. I know this is pretty deep and technical, but I hope it was useful to those people who either already are using Sentinel or who might be using Sentinel in the near future. This will give you some ideas of how to go about testing them. And my contact information is here. I'll hang around up here in the front of the room for 10 minutes or so. And feel free to talk to me outside or email me, or you can reach me through the Slack. Okay, thank you very much.